Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am delighted, as always, to be with you on a Tuesday for an author interview. It is Tuesday. It is the middle to endish of February. Time's just flying by as usual. I hope that you are having a great week so far. Hope that your weekend was nice, whatever you may have done. Hope you had some good weather, or at least not weather that you hated. Our weather was beautiful. Oh my gosh, it's back up to around 70 right now, and sunshine, beautiful, gorgeous sunshine. And I'm sorry if your weather stinks and I'm rubbing salt in the wound by telling you about the beautiful sunshine here, but it has just been gorgeous. And on Saturday, we went for a 3.5 mile walk. The dogs kept looking at us like, really? Why? Can we just go home and go back to our little bed now, please? They did great, but that was so nice. It was just nice to soak up all of that sunshine. It's definitely good for mental health, and I am glad that we took that time and got out. We went for a walk on Sunday too, but it was only 2 miles, so not the 3.5 of Saturday. And then we try to walk most days with the dogs. I know I've mentioned that before, but it's a nice part of our day. It gets us out and about and a change of scenery, and it gets me away from my desk where I have terrible posture. I try to catch that, but I just have terrible posture when it comes to sitting at my desk, and the more I concentrate, the more I hunch. So getting up and walking and out and away from my desk is a very, very good thing. So I hope that whatever you did this weekend, it was in some way beneficial and healthy and made you happy in some way. Maybe that was just staying at home and reading a book all weekend. I completely support that plan, as I'm sure you know. Speaking of books, I am speaking with author A.D. Nauman today about her book, Down the Steep. It is historical fiction. We're in the 1960s at this time. I mentioned at the end of the last episode that I would be speaking with A.D. today, and this was the book. It is super, super important. It is not always the easiest, especially at the beginning, because it deals with some pretty heavy topics, and we talk a little bit about that in the interview, but let me go ahead and give you the description of the book. Again, it is called Down the Steep. The year is 1963 in small-town Virginia. Willa McCoy is a strong-minded teenager who longs to follow in the footsteps of her father, an important member of the KKK. Willa believes the Klan is daring and brave like the father she idolizes. She wants only to rise in his esteem. He wants only to keep everyone in their place. When Willa is sent to babysit for the new minister's wife, Ruth Swanson, she finds herself at Ruth's kitchen table with Langston Jones, a smart young black man. At first, they despise each other, but they have one thing in common. They both love Ruth. When Langston reveals a secret he's discovered, that Willa's father is having an affair, the once loyal daughter plots to destroy her father's reputation, unwittingly setting into motion a series of events that leads to her family's demise. A lot going on in that description, isn't there? It's not the longest description, but there's a lot going on. So yeah, you can see why it might be difficult to read, because Willa is the character, the protagonist, the one that we want to root for, knowing she's that main character. But in the beginning, it's hard sometimes with the way she's idolizing her father, and with the way her father behaves and acts, and some of the things that he does. A lot of the things that he does, it's hard, but it's so important, because it is a period of history that is not that long ago. It is, a generation, 2 generations removed. We've got people who are, the people who are living in this time period, they are still alive. They are still around. This is not that far removed in the past. And it is important to understand that things that we think sometimes are, oh, that's in the past, that doesn't affect us today, are still incredibly important and still incredibly prevalent in the way that we think and the way that we view the world. And so sometimes being reminded, like I was vastly uncomfortable during parts of reading about the Klan and the activities, and I don't enjoy that uncomfortableness, but I know how important it is to sit within that feeling of not being comfortable and knowing that that history is so important and still affects relationships and events today. So another reason that I think historical fiction is one of the best things that you can read to get yourself interested in different time periods, to learn about people that you may not know as much about, and then hopefully set you on the path of learning even more about that time period and about those people, and maybe challenging some of your own assumptions, or helping you to broaden a worldview that you might not even have known you needed to broaden. So just my usual plug for historical fiction and how important and wonderful of a genre it is and can be, and how much I learn from it specifically. So again, the book is Down the Steep. The author is A.D. Nauman, and let's go ahead and turn to that conversation so A.D. can tell you more about the book and the writing of it. Hi, A.D. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here, and I am looking forward to talking to you about your novel, Down the Steep. Before we do the book, though, let's get to know you a little bit, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I currently live in the Chicago area, although I did grow up mostly in Southeast Virginia, the Tidewater region. I teach at a university, but I'm not an English professor. I'm a professor of literacy education, which means that I work with K through 12 teachers on how to better teach reading and writing to their students, which is a wonderful gig. I feel very lucky to have this wonderful day job. I have been writing fiction all my life. I have a daughter who is grown and gone, but she is the love of my life. and I have a cat, black and white cat.
Does your cat know that your daughter is the love of your life and not the cat? Have you told the cat?
Suspects she is the love of my life. It's true.
Yes. Cats. Well, I love your day job. I think that is amazing, wonderful work. That is just great. But as I said, the name of the book is Down the Steep. So can you start by giving an overview of the story?
Absolutely. So this is a novel that is set in the civil rights era, and it takes place in a fictitious small town in Southeast Virginia. It's the story of teenager Willa McCoy, who is the daughter of a man who's pretty high up in their local KKK. And at first, Willa worships her father and wants to be just like him. But her father is a man who just wants to keep everyone in their place, including girls and women. So Willa can never gain his respect. He thinks that women are really only good for bringing you food and cleaning your house and taking care of your children. So then a stranger comes to town. Ruth Swanson is the wife of the new minister of the McCoy's church. The Swansons are from Minnesota and are secretly there in Southeast Virginia to support the civil rights movement in sort of a quiet, clandestine way. The Swansons have 2 young girls, and Ruth is struggling with multiple sclerosis. So Willa's parents send Willa to help Ruth with housework and childcare every day after school. And therefore Ruth becomes a mentor for Willa, sort of a caring, older sister / mother figure. But Ruth has also befriended a smart young black man named Langston, And so Willa is thrown into close proximity with this young man. So there she is, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with a black boy. And they despise each other at first. Langston and Willa despise each other. Langston knows who her father is, so they clash, but they both love Ruth, so their paths keep crossing. Then one evening, Langston reveals a secret about Willa's father that devastates her and enables her to see her father's true character. So there's a major shift in her, and she rebels against her father and his beliefs, and is eventually able to overcome her own racism. But in the meantime, she sets into motion a series of events that end in the ruin of her family. And I don't want to give away any spoilers, so I'll end it there.
Right. Yeah, you want people to read it. So
yes.
The first bit of the book with getting to know Willa and getting to know her family it's hard to read from a modern perspective because, my gosh, her dad really is just such a piece of work, and we are getting such an inside glimpse of the Klan and the racism and the sexism and everything of this time. But it's so important to get the character arc that we need with Willa. But how was the writing of it for you? You know, I'm sure it was emotionally charged in terms of writing.
It was extremely hard. At one point, I actually paused in my writing and thought, who's going to want to read about this racist girl who, and that's one reason why I started with the prologue and made it clear that, Willa, as a grown woman, has overcome the racism. So you're not wondering all the way through what is going to happen with this young woman. But, it was very difficult. It made me feel kind of sick to my stomach. It made me worry about my Black friends, and I, just hoping that they wouldn't be too offended by this. One thing that I discovered that was kind of interesting in a chilling way, was it was pretty, I've grown up in a culture of social justice, but I found it very easy to channel the racism that's just floating around in our culture. When I sat down and thought, all right, so what is this racist girl thinking? It was pretty easy to tap into that because it's just so prevalent in the air here, even in Chicago. But yes, it was an emotionally charged thing and very difficult to do. It was extremely hard to write Dick McCoy, that's Willa's father. And I found I had to do a whole set of exercises to figure out his backstory and try to make him more palatable to me to write about him. And I did. I think that worked pretty well.
It is interesting though, because, when you read it and you think, oh my gosh, thank goodness we've moved on from this time period. But your comment about how easy it is to tap into those sentiments because they are still so very prevalent. And with that, it is time for our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about Willa as that main character. And even though she initially, it's a little hard sometimes when you're sitting with that uncomfortableness, it's maybe a little hard to see her as a character you want to root for. We're going to talk about what about her as a character makes you want to root for her, what will resonate with readers. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author A.D. Nauman about her historical fiction novel, Down the Steep. Let's return to that conversation. Let's talk a little bit more about Willa. She is hard to like at the beginning because she's so entrenched in that culture and that mindset. But what about her is going to resonate with readers as they go through her character arc?
Well, I'm hoping that readers will resonate with the fact that she's she's a flawed character, but also very strong, determined. She recognizes the unfair treatment that she is being exposed to, and she's fighting against that, even though she has this racist streak in her. And so she's at least trying to be a champion for girls and women. So she makes bad decisions because she's missing key pieces of understanding. But again, she's fighting against her own unfair treatment, and she does have the capacity to identify the illogic in racist thinking, which I think is important and gives the reader, some hope that she's going to grow and change. When her awful history teacher starts talking about the rebellion of Nat Turner and how these slaves were animals for rebelling, and Willa asks, well, why didn't they all rebel? And then the teacher says, well, because they're cowardly. So Willa realizes, so if they don't rebel, they're cowards. If they do rebel, they're beasts. Okay, something's wrong here. And she does that a few times. And I do think that that's something that readers might find resonant.
I would agree. I mean, that's one of the scenes where I thought, okay, yes, her brain is engaged. She's 13 when we meet her, and that is not always the most self-aware time period. You can be pretty self-absorbed at 13. I certainly was. Yes. So the fact that she could recognize that, it definitely is one of those points where you're like, okay, this is good. This gives us hope. What was your initial inspiration for the story itself?
So the book reads like a memoir, but it's fiction. So it is fiction, and yet it's rooted in my real experience. So the Swanson family in the book, the minister's family, was based on my own family. My father was a minister when I was a kid, and between 1963 and 1967, we lived in a small town in Virginia, and I don't want to name it. And we moved from Ohio. So my parents actually grew up in the North. And then then we moved away from that small town to other places. Then we moved back to the region. Then years went by. And over the years, my mom would occasionally say to me, there were Klan members in that church, referring to the church that we were at in this small town in Virginia. Mm-hmm. And it slowly dawned on me that this might be an interesting thing to write about. And I was able to gather my parents' memories and my older sister's memories. And actually, I have some dim memories myself. One of my earliest memories, and I must have been 3 or 4 years old, is of a Klan march. I remember it was a very hot day. We were standing on the street. So that scene in the book when the Klan marches is actually based on some of my own fuzzy memories. I remember as a little kid thinking, this is like a parade, but no one seems happy. It was very confusing. People seemed very tense. The sidewalk was packed and everyone just seemed very tense. And I remember the clatter of the footsteps and obviously the hoods, the robes. And also there was the noise of clanging. So they must have been carrying chains, which of course I didn't understand when I was a little kid what that meant, but now I do. So that certainly was etched in my memory. And I I started writing the book, ironically, during the Obama administration, because I felt like, yeah, you were hearing people on the news say, "Oh, we're in a post-racial society." And I felt like, no, that's not true. There's still an awful lot of racism beneath the surface here. And then obviously obviously I was right, because it erupted when Trump got elected. And now white supremacy is ascending. So I did want to write a novel that might help people think through our racist past and our racist tendencies, and to acknowledge that racism is still a big problem in our country, as well as sexism and misogyny. Not think, oh, well, this is something from the past. Thank goodness we're not like that anymore, because I think that was one of the mechanisms of the backlash against the civil rights movement. People thinking, oh, we fixed that. Now everything's fine. Clearly everything is not fine. So that was the inspiration. It did come out of my own experience, and I think the idea kept growing in my head because I'm concerned about our country. And I wanted to try to trace the roots of our modern day culture wars back. I thought I would find it in the 1960s, and the 1960s were definitely a way station, but really the roots of our culture wars, of course, go all the way back to 1619.
Yeah, absolutely. And I keep seeing this graphic on Facebook that it's like a gas gauge. So showing an arc, and it shows, from 1619 up through, I can't remember the date, but there's a very, it's through the Civil War. So through America, through slavery, and then from slavery to the Civil Rights Movement, and then the Civil Rights Movement to now, which is a tiny, tiny little piece of that history. And I think it's so important that we remember that we're not that far away from it.
No.
The fact that, Ruby Bridges, the little girl with the integration of the one school, is only in her 60s, and people think that's so far back there.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
Yeah. When you sat down to write the story and you were thinking about Willa, but also the other characters, I know you talked a little bit about her father and trying to figure out his backstory. How much of that character development do you like to do before you start writing, and how much do you prefer to let evolve as you write?
I think it's equal parts, thinking and writing. The characters definitely evolve as I write, which is why it's so annoying. You have to go back and revise all this stuff you already wrote. So I mentioned doing some character work on Dick McCoy, that was important. And, so as I was writing, so I created the character of Willa, and I started writing in her voice. And as we went through the book, as we journeyed on our path, I would ask myself, well, what would she do in this situation? Okay, now this has happened. What's her response? And then what happens from that response? And then how would these people react? And I think in doing that kind of work, you do get to know your characters increasingly in depth, because you're learning how they interpret what's happening, and then how they react, their beliefs, their expectations, their motivations. So yeah, it's a journey. I think of writing a novel as taking a long road trip. I do love long road trips, but you start. I generally know my destination. I don't start writing something without knowing where it's going to end, because I feel like that would drive me crazy. I need to know what the end is. But you're going, you're going along a route, And sometimes you take little detours and you have to get back on the road. And sometimes you're surprised by what you encounter as you're going. So that's how I think of characters developing.
Sure, yeah. Makes a lot of sense. It is now time for our second break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking about research, specifically some of the research that went into the writing of this historical fiction novel and parts that AD found particularly interesting and challenging. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author A.D. Nauman. As you know, we are talking about Down the Steep, which is her historical fiction novel set in the 1960s. Let's return to that conversation. And how about research? You could have probably researched forever, but how much research and what types of research did you do for the story?
Well, you're right. I could have researched forever. And that's always a challenge when you're trying to write historical fiction. I read lots and lots of nonfiction about the history of slavery. Again, not a fuzzy, warm kind of read. I did want to mention one of the books, though, written by a man whose last name is Baptist, just like Baptist. And it's called The Half Has Never Been Told. And it's this incredibly detailed and, of course, mortifying history of slavery. I learned so much from it. And I really think that to understand racism in our country, you need that level of knowledge. So that was one of the books I read. I also read about, racism and classism in the U.S. now. I read books about the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which had a huge impact. It was the catalyst for the rise of the Klan again. And it's still sort of interwoven into our educational woes. And also, the history of the KKK, I would not call that a fun read. And modern day white supremacy thinking, which is horrifying again. And part of the reason why I wanted to add the epilogue, because I wanted to show that thread of white supremacy is continues to run through our history all the way up to the modern day. Certainly lots of internet searching. When I was researching Nat Turner's Rebellion, which I had fun with in having Willa's character do the same thing, I was so struck by the different accounts of it, how you really couldn't pin down exactly how many white people were killed. And just again, how the accounts differed. And then I would read things written in the past about the further past and the interpretations put on those events. So indeed, I read one account of the Nat Turner Rebellion that said it was never determined why he rebelled. What? It seems obvious to us now why he rebelled.
Right.
I'm interested in that event in particular because the small town where we lived in Virginia was just 10 miles from the location of Nat Turner's rebellion. What also struck me earlier today? So the response to that rebellion was extremely brutal. And it seems like there's a parallel with what's going on in Israel and Palestine today. So here's this brutal, awful rebellion. And it was brutal. Nat Turner and his fellow enslaved people who were joining him in this murderous rampage were macheting and stabbing and using axes to kill the white plantation owners, and there were an awful lot of children killed. So it was horrible, but the horror of that reflected why they were rebelling. It wasn't like, oh, I have no idea why you would feel this angry toward us. So it was, not justifiable, but understandable. And then the response to it was very, very brutal. There was widespread panic through the South that all the slaves were rebelling, and white men on horses would just ride down the road, killing the black people they encountered. And hundreds of black people were killed after that rebellion. So anyway, I learned so many interesting things in my research. And one thing that draws me to writing historical fiction is doing this research because the past explains the present. And it really helps me understand better what's going on now. And I'm hoping to convey that to readers too. A couple of other interesting ways I researched were I went back to the small town with my sister where we lived and went to their local library and found old newspapers from 1963 on actual microfiche. That was a lot of fun. And I found an actual editorial in those newspapers about the poll tax in a newspaper from 1963. So that was accurate. That's what they were talking about in 1963. Should we get rid of the poll tax? And here's the argument, for keeping it. I also looked at magazines and catalogs from that period, which were interesting. It helped me understand that cultural context. One thing that didn't make it into the book was at the time the Russians had sent a female astronaut into space. And this was being commented on it was a magazine like Newsweek or Life, something like that. It was being commented on. And the comment was, well, we in America like our women to be more feminine. So it was considered unfeminine for this woman astronaut to be going into space. And we were very proud of the fact that we like our women to be more feminine. So again, helping me understand that the cultural milieu of the time, which I think is very important because I have a strong belief that our cultural context impacts our identity and who we are and what we want, what we believe. So I needed to understand that time period a little bit better.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a coming of age story for Willa, but the place where she's growing up is so important. That time period that she's growing up, everything is so relevant to her own story and her own understanding and the reason that she has the growth of character and the opening of her eyes to the racism around her. So, I mean, all of that really comes together, intersects within that coming of age story. It's a bit of a complicated question because it's a nuanced, layered, complicated book, but what do you hope readers might take away from it?
Well, let's see. So one thing that I wanted to convey is the possibility for growth, for personal growth. I grew up at a time when people were constantly saying, well, people don't change, people don't know, they never change. And for anyone who had a spouse, I mean, we know we can't change other people, but people can change, and they can grow, and they can change their minds, and they can re-examine their beliefs. So I was hoping that it was an illustration of that, how yes, people do indeed change, given the right circumstances. I thought of this as sort of a thought experiment for how racism might be overcome. And I thought that might be interesting for readers to think about. So, for instance, Willa starts with an experience of unfair treatment in her own life. And then she's exposed to a different perspective, an outside perspective, from a caring mentor. Ruth Swanson isn't wagging her finger at Willa and saying, yeah, don't say that. And no, don't use that language. And you can't say that. Ruth is actually trying to understand Willa and accepting her as she is, and then nudging her forward. And then Willa ends up in proximity with the other, with Langston, the person she has these prejudices against, and gets to know him better. Integration, being more familiar with people who don't look like you, people who aren't in your demographic group, and understanding that there's that humanity that runs through us all. It's, we don't have to other people, and we don't have to think of the human race in terms of us versus them. But then I also felt like that alone wasn't enough, that she needed that sort of traumatic break from her father, realizing that her father was not a good guy, and he was a liar, and that realization, I think, bumped her into onto a path that led to her finally being able to challenge those old beliefs. And so it was, in a way, kind of an imaginary roadmap for how we might overcome our own racism, because we are all born into a culture where racism is rampant, whether we see it or not. Another point in the book was, I did want to make a distinction between the place, Virginia, Southeast Virginia, and the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, because Virginians think of themselves as not that. They think of themselves as very nice and gracious people, and they are. And that horrible racism is an issue for other people, but not them. They're very kind to their, quote unquote, colored people. And I think that attitude is kind of rampant in other places in the U.S. Northerners in particular. I meet people who live here in Chicago, and they've grown up in the area, and they look at the South as some distant foreign land, and racism's awful there, as though it's not awful here too. And it is. Chicago has the most segregated school system, I think, in the country. So I wanted people to understand that, again, to look critically, examine critically their own surroundings, the pond they're swimming in, and realize what's there. And I also hoped that the book would just spark conversations about racism and sexism in the country, and how they persist, even though we're improving. And I would say we're definitely improving, but there are these backlashes and these, you've taken 2 steps back in terms of fair treatment and equality and equity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important I think sometimes it's important to read something like this that kind of makes you take a look around and shocks your sensibilities a little bit to get you thinking more critically. Time for our final break of this episode. When we come back, AD will talk about what pushed her to write for publication, as well as her advice for aspiring authors. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my conversation with author A.D. Nauman. You mentioned before that you've been writing your whole life. What pushed you to decide to write for publication?
Well, I've always been writing for publications. I've published several short stories in literary journals, and this is my second novel. I had a novel that came out in 2001. So it's been a long road, Sarah. It's a tough gig to try to be a literary writer in the U.S. You just have to sort of stick to it.
Absolutely, yes. So along those lines, what advice would you have for someone who's thinking they might want to try writing for publication?
There's a joke that goes around, and I don't remember now who it was, when someone asked him that question. This was a writer. Someone asked a famous writer that question, and he said, "My advice is find something else to do." And then that's just so cynical. It is very hard. It's a very hard road. There are so many brilliant writers out there, and it's increasingly hard to get published. That said, okay, so you just have to be really tough and really persistent, but people can do that. That is fine. I would say to get clear on what you want to write about and why you want to write. Yeah, I think that young writers today get the consistent message that learning how to write is all about learning craft. And that certainly is a big part of it. But another big part of it is ideas, what you're writing about. And it's having something to say that other people need to hear. We understandably, when we first start writing, write about ourselves and our broken hearts and how we're bored at our jobs and how our parents don't understand us. But you want to kind of evolve beyond that. Toni Morrison had a wonderful piece of advice that you want to write books that are not out in the world yet, but need to be. That's not a direct quote. That's how she thinks of what to write. Once I had a friend who was a professional photographer, and she was giving me tips on how to take pictures. And she had a piece of advice that I think really applies to writing as well. She said, look through the camera lens, look through it, point your camera around. She said, and ask yourself, have you seen this picture before? And if you have, if you've seen the picture of the lovely landscape, don't take that picture. Take a picture of something you have not seen before. And I think the same applies to writing. Don't write the same books that have already been written. Try to write something that is unique to yourself. I think it takes a while to get there. It's not something that 22-year-olds do very well. I think that you really do need that life experience and a knowledge of yourself, knowledge of your values, knowledge of just your worldview to be able to write something truly original to yourself. So that's what I would say to aspiring writers, to just think about the ideas as much as they think about craft issues.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. So I did actually jump over a question. I usually ask if you're working on anything new currently that you want to talk about.
I am. So I'm very excited about my new project. It is set during the Great Depression. So it's another historical novel, and set in Williamsburg, Virginia. So set in the same region. And in the 1930s is when the reconstruction of colonial Williamsburg was occurring. Before 1926, Williamsburg was this dusty little town that was falling into ruin. And then an Anglican preacher decided he wanted to restore it to its original glory back in colonial times. So he persuaded J.D. Rockefeller to fund it. And obviously I go back to that region, and one day I was touring the governor's palace with my sister, and I was just struck by how here during the Great Depression, J.D. Rockefeller is spending millions and millions of dollars to reconstruct colonial Williamsburg. So the story is a young couple gets married in Chicago, and he's a historian who gets a job on the reconstruction of colonial Williamsburg. So they move there. She leaves her teaching job that she loves. She teaches kids, move to Williamsburg, and she then becomes a housewife. And he is trying to make good at his new job as a historian, which involves kowtowing to a bunch of wealthy donors. So he is having to agree with everything these very conservative, wealthy donors believe. And this is when it's set in 1932, at the end of Herbert Hoover's presidency, when FDR is running for his first term. In the meantime, the wife gets bored at home, makes a new friend, and takes up with a group of communists who are laborers on the sites at Colonial Williamsburg. And the tensions arise, and we wonder if the marriage will last. But I'm having a lot of fun with that.
Oh, I can imagine that the research on this one was lots of fun.
Yes.
Yes. And yeah, I've been to Williamsburg, but I'm not sure I ever realized that they started that, the revitalization, like during the Great Depression. That's crazy.
I thought so too. And of course a response would be, well, they were creating jobs, and
yes.
That was true. Actually, they were creating jobs. On the other hand,
right. There's
yes.
always another hand.
Yes, there's always another hand.
How about reading? When you take time to read just for you, what are your favorite genres and authors?
Well, I do love reading literary fiction. Elizabeth Mackenzie is one of my favorites. She has an older book called The Portable Veblen. I think that came out in 2016. And then she has a new book called The Dog of the North. I enjoy her because she pushes at the boundaries. She doesn't, write formulaically. And I read a lot of nonfiction. Right now I'm reading the book Sapiens, which is extremely interesting. I tend to read a lot of non-American authors, I realize. So my favorites include Alice Munro, Ian McEwan, William Trevor. So they're British, they're Irish, they're Canadian. Patrick White was Australian. I feel like the structure and the writing outside of the US is different enough that it really sparks your imagination. So I like to read literary fiction by some non-American authors too.
Sure. And you can always then travel within your own brain and go somewhere new.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If people are interested in learning more about Down the Steep or you as an author, can you share a website if you have one and any social media that you're active on?
Sure. The website is adnauman.com, and Nauman is Nauman. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook. You can go to my website and click on the social media. I have gotten off of Twitter/X.
Okay. Well, perfect. Thank you for that. We have covered a few different topics during our time together, but is there anything that we have not touched on that you want to make sure you highlight?
I kind of feel like I've highlighted everything that I would like to say. I do think that it's so important for people to keep reading fiction and nonfiction both, to be better informed about what's going on around them, to better understand what's going on around them. Reading just makes your life better. It makes you smarter. It makes you happier. It makes you feel more in control of your life. So I guess I'm speaking now as my professor self. It's encouraging people to read. You can turn off the screen sometimes and pick up an old-fashioned book and really grow through the experience.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about Down the Steep and all of the issues brought up within the novel as well as writing itself. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again so much to AD for joining me to talk about this book. I've mentioned my reasons for loving historical fiction, and they are many and varied. But if this is something that you are interested in reading more about, you should definitely check out Down the Steep by AD. If you know someone in your life who is interested in this time period, who has a love of historical fiction, who maybe is just wanting to learn more about the South during this time, then this is a book that you should definitely check out because it's going to be an accessible way to see through the eyes of this young woman, Willa, and what her experiences were in that time period. And as she grew to realize that a lot of what she had been raised with was maybe not the best way of viewing the world, and that idolizing her father was maybe not her best way of, again, viewing the world and seeing the man that she had put up on such a high pedestal. So definitely check out this book if you are interested. Thank you, as always, for joining me. Please join me for the next episode. I cannot, at this point, tell you what author I will be speaking to. There's a few lined up, and things are shifting. So this just brings up that wonderful point of like, follow, subscribe on whatever podcast platform you are listening on, because that way you will be notified when there is a new episode. There will be a new episode next week on Tuesday, as usual. I just cannot tell you who the author will be 100% for sure. You gotta love schedules and crazy things that happen to alter those schedules. We're just rolling with the punches. If you have not done so already, helping the podcast out, a great way to help the podcast out is to leave a review, written, starred, what have you. Doesn't have to be complicated. Don't overthink it. I'm the queen of overthinking, but you don't have to overthink it, and it really, really does help the podcast. So thank you in advance if you choose to leave a review on the podcast, again, on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. If you're on social media, you can also follow the podcast on Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. As always, I love hearing from you. Let me know what you're reading. Let me know what you're up to. Just come find the podcast and me on social media and let the podcast, what have you, know what you're reading, what books by the authors that I've spoken to you have read, etc., etc. I hope you're having a great week. I hope that whatever is going on in your week, I hope there's sunshine. But if there's not, I hope that you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Maybe a good book with lots of sunshine. Thanks. Talk to you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.